Welcome back to Soul to Soul. My name is Wayne Marentette. This is number 10 in our series, or my series of discussions. When I first started, I told you there would be 12 tapes, 12 hours of instruction. Now I know that after the first three, which was more about my background, that I started with sentiency and went on from there, I know that I gave a lot of information, but it's intended that the viewer take this information, review it, look it over, search out details on the internet, or find other resources that you can. If you need any help with that, just ask. I'll probably be providing some direct insight into where you can go for other information as we go along. But the last class we had, restoration of the, everything is a matter of conscience. That's where we were. Forgive me for that. We talked about how it was possible that through the restoration of our conscience, we could integrate our personality and our soul with the hope that eventually that integrated personality and soul would move on to a final integration between soul, personality, and spirit, culminating in what we would call the ascension process or the attainment of the Christ conscious cosmic consciousness. All of these various terms that we find for identifying initiations where an individual actually goes through a process where they actually change, their consciousness expands, and there are changes. I mentioned earlier that I went through a couple. My first one, which was the simplest one, only happened only a few years after my accident, and I was sitting quietly. It was a point where I was at a very difficult moment. I had some serious decisions to make, and I was under a lot of pressure. My health wasn't that great, but I've been sitting on the balcony meditating in the attempt to resolve myself to get ready to deal with the situations that were at hand, financially and otherwise. I was broke. I found myself in Winnipeg, Manitoba with little or nothing on my way to Toronto. And anyway, in this situation, I'm sitting there meditating. At the end of the meditation, I paused, was looking around, just trying to take in a moment of enjoyment. And I heard this statement: do you repent of your intent? And in that same moment, I was frozen. I locked in. I couldn't go to my mind as a reference. I couldn't use my heart as a reference. I couldn't get memories. But I knew in the sound, it was like a full comprehension came with it. Do you repent of your intent? It pointed it out to me. And my immediate response was, yes, of all my intent up until now. And when I realized I was passing through the initiation, 5 minutes later, I was different. It was great relief, but it wasn't the ultimate, let's say, expanded consciousness initiation. It was a preliminary. It was as if I was being I was being advised that at this stage of, let's say, aspirant, tending to move towards mastery, that these things had to be achieved. So I took note of it, put it into my notes, and then I developed everything around the matters of conscience, which all came out. So it was a master thought form. But at the same time, I also recalled in my afterlife experience in 1979, I was given two very serious, expanded, what I call master thought forms. Now, let me explain what a thought form is. As children, we pick up words, we pick up our language, we pick up ideas, sometimes concepts. But as we develop these ideas, we go from an idea to a concept to perception to realization to enlightenment, meaning that whatever we do learn about, if we focus on it, study into it, or try to capture and expand on that, it does cause us to move up to another level, conceptual, where we have theories and ideas about the thing. And we take those theories and try to put them into practice, and we move up to a perceptual level. Then it becomes conscious later on, so that it's no longer an unconscious fighting and hanging on to what you do know and recycling it every day in the attempt to gain new inspirations. It culminates. And in my case, when it was over, I realized how I had to keep myself from that day forward if I was to stay on the path. The restoration of the conscience of humanity was the first thought form. It was actually spelled out like this: They told me that the restoration of the conscience of humanity would be occurring in the final stages of their process. And this was in 1979. When that was going to be, I had no idea at the time. And I remember yesterday, or the last time we talked, I spoke of being given a vision, standing in front of the earth, looking at it, souls coming in, going out, and globes going into the future in a spiral pattern. And they told me that this was the timeline of the earth process of our different humanity, our various groups within humanity, and how we would attain the outcome. I forgot to add to that and suggest to you that when they showed me this, I realized that I was looking at various outcomes. And in between these outcomes, not much information was given. So I studied into it and I found out that through every 52 years, we have a set of new decisions being made for our planet, for the evolution of humanity, based on the level of consciousness appropriated by the masses. In other words, there would be a small percentage advancing to a higher level of consciousness through frequency adjustment, study, change, transformation. And there would be those at the very bottom who are just starting to hear about it. And somewhere in between, we'd have other groups. Nowadays, we hear terms like first waivers, second waivers, third waivers. Well, I'm 68 years old and I am an old soul. And what I got from that back then was that the restoration of the conscience of humanity was a determined outcome that we could not prevent. Just like our history, there are certain outcomes that must be, and I'll tell you why. It's already happened. We're living in a past tense. That's right. We're living in a past tense, moving through time, identifying how it was that humanity got to this stage and what occurred next. What I'm saying is, I entered in this life into the last chapter of the evolving process of humanity under the egoic transition, or under the control mechanisms that were provided in this world that keep us dumbed down. Meaning anybody that was going to become enlightened up until now would be very, very difficult. And it was. There have been a number, I think it was over 116 in Tibet, that have achieved light body ascension. And they all had to go through the restoration of their conscience at some point before they started focusing on purity and love and achieving that light body. This was natural. And every 52 years, a new rhythm would be imposed on the earth to help and guide those who were continuing in this process. Now, we go back 150 years ago, and we've got 3 conclaves, what we call Wesak festivals, the April, May, and June full moon of every year, when it gets initiated. We get a new word for the year, a new status to achieve, a new insight, or a series of insights to gain before the end, and it's leveled all over a 52-year period. And on a larger scale, we have aeons, about every 2,150 years. We had the Piscean age, now we're moving and are in the Aquarian age. So when I got this impression that there are guarantees that certain outcomes would inevitably have to occur, I realized then that this is what they were showing me, that the people alive today, for example, you went to a theater, an outdoor theater, like a drive-in, and you're watching the movie, and they're showing you the year 2100, the future. Well, there'd be a definite outcome. So you're seeing the movie of how we achieve this standard by the year 2100, and you're sitting back and looking at it and enjoying it. Well, in that view, a lot of us get revelations, realizations, assistance, aid from our higher selves and from the source. That gives us an idea of what we're going through, why, and what processes. Well, I watched those for 40 years. I watched the transition right up until 1986, 87, where Bill Clinton stood at the UN, and it was a time of harmonic convergence. And I knew then what was going on. The peace that had broken out in the world, the walls in Berlin had come down. Peace was breaking out everywhere, and it stopped at Tiananmen Square. We all remember that. But I knew it wasn't the end, that this final purge would be necessary. And if you look at the recent movies in, say, the last 10 to 15 years, we see the same thing, this fabulous outcome for humanity if they can only achieve and get beyond ignorance or fight off evil. It seems to be the core reality. Well, in my experience, what I saw was guaranteed outcomes that meant that I was going to make it, and so was everybody else. However, if we tried to change that outcome, or if we did something today or tomorrow that was lacking principle, lacking conscience, morals, ethics, that reality, then we would be falling off the path, and we'd have to recycle back. Now, a lot of us knew when we came here that this process was going to occur, but it got mind swiped. We were blank slated when we came. So only our innate spiritual instincts at work, giving us clues as to our historic memories and who we are, what we are. Very few people ever get those unless they do direct, intentional study. That's willful and dedicated, consistent, persistent over time. In my case, I spent over 35 years every day consistently, always searching out new inspirations, recording them, expanding on them, putting them into the process, identifying what it would take for someone to learn it, what would happen to them if they did. And I started to use the idea that I could envision the outcome of someone's attainment by observing them today. Lacking in conscience, integrity, I could tell how long it would take for a person based on their morality and the quality of their morality in the present. So some individuals, if they were to start studying today, it would only take them 2-3 years. Others, 3 months. Others, 30 years. And I wondered, how could this event that I was informed about actually occur and include everyone, because no one is going to be left out. So the more I went into it, the more I realized. And then this morning, before I came, I recalled, and I thought, I'm going to tell them about this event that I had, this experience. And it was regarding the future events. But at one point in my afterlife process, I was shown my higher self in a futuristic scenario. I was much taller. My skin was a blue, gold, white, radiant color. I took it for granted. It seemed absolutely natural to me. Of course, I was experiencing my future self then. And I looked around the facility that I was in, and I recognized that we were not on Earth. It was some other place. But it was timeless. And there was high-tech technology that I understood, that I barely understood when I came back into my physical body. And now I see it all around me here today, or the beginnings of it. And I realized what was going on. Now, I got to tell you, I saw myself sitting in a lounge kind of a chair, and I had a headset on. And this chair facilitated what I was about to do. And this is my future self. I'm already achieved my mastery, and there I am as an adult in this room. And I looked up, and the walls were a diamond, it was glass, but it was diamond crystal, thick, and you couldn't penetrate it. And it was very protective and very secure. It just seemed a natural thing that they built with or drew out of the environment to produce an environment. Anyway, I looked up in towards the ceiling, and I saw a monitor. It was right in the glass itself, and I saw the picture of the Earth. And I wondered what this was, and I realized that I was projecting my thoughts into the Earth in the year that I was born, and I was reviewing my entire lifetime. And then after the afterlife experience, when I reawoke, I reviewed it again. And I noticed that when I looked up at the monitor that I had seen in my vision, it was still there, and it was a picture of the Earth. But there was all kinds of data points that I was unable to read next to it. Later, I was informed that when I was looking at this projection, this is how we can see ourselves today. In other words, as a spiritual being on an advanced level, a higher dimension, one of our preoccupations for greater education, which is a tendency, is to go out and experience historic scenarios. Now, the one on Earth, and why I chose Earth, was because it was the last chapter in the history of ignorance on planet Earth. And this meant a lot. Throughout the universe, evolution is a standard process. We get to a certain point, we get a language, and then when we get vision, a mind, then that language and that mind reincorporate and give us more of a control over our consciousness, and our awareness expands. So over time, we eventually become conscious and fight to gain our enlightenment and then pass on. Or we don't know about it, don't find out about it, and some calamity happens, and we passed off the earth with a group or mass exodus, like the flood, where almost everybody died. And that group of souls had to wait to recycle back in to finish the goal. They had already attained, for example, in Atlantis, there was a high number of initiates that had already attained 5, 6, 7 and a higher dimensional frequency. And they were producing in technologies that eventually destroyed them, because they were being misused or appropriated for the incorrect use. Put it that way. There's two uses for everything, good and bad. I'll let that fire engine go by. So anyway, as I'm reviewing this process, realizing that everyone has to go through this process, it's a it's a state of knowledge. Knowledge keeps processing itself until we hit a moment of wisdom. And usually it's after 28 to 35, 35 to 42. That's when we come into the wisdom stages of our earlier knowledge. That's where we transcend the child and the over-emotional personality and come into adulthood. And with maturity, we can review our past and see a line of progression of how we developed, which is common for every life. Well, this is also the same scale used on a large, large scale of 30,000 years, where humanity begins their process of reaching for the stars or just recognizing their own nature, and eventually we reach that cycle. Well, when I was told that it was the revelation of realization that people would receive through the restoration of the conscience of humanity, I still didn't comprehend exactly what it meant, but I had a good sense of what it meant. That anybody who didn't restore their conscience by this time would find themselves struggling with their ego. So I'll explain that when we talk about the event and today's session, which will be about the ascension itself. But for a few minutes, I'd like to go back and tell you a story. As I'm sitting in this futuristic scenario, observing how I chose to pick this particular life that I'm in now and what I was hoping for, I also got to see what the basic outcome, the vision of eternity was for everyone assisting humanity in the process. So what I realized was we're at the culminating stage of an event that takes us out of the lower 3D human ignorance, trial, tribulation, fear, love, duality. All of this that we're now overcoming has to be overcome. It had to be dealt with in this last century. And right now, we're ready to go into the actual process itself. And it's happening on a worldwide scale. We will no longer be living on Earth in the next 10 years as we see it. Many things are going to change, transition, and I'll tell you about that. In earlier instructions, we've talked about the restoration of the conscience of humanity, or people restoring their personality conscientiousness to integrate their personality with their soul. And that seems to be where everyone is today, whether they know it or not. We are being upgraded on a daily basis, and over a period of 2 to 3 years. Now, this has been going on for quite a while, but in the next few years, we're going to reach into experiences that take us out of our ignorance and bring us into reality. And our reaction and response to that will determine a great deal about what we will go through in the end. But to talk about it, let's talk about it as the actual event. There are two main events that I'm aware of. There was one event that was an actual initiation for me. And this happened in 1991, 12 years after my accident. The same experience I had had while identifying with my higher self in the afterlife was now my experience in form. I was sitting in I was sitting in Zihuatanejo, Mexico. I had just done 3 weeks of direct conversation, discourse, instruction, and assisting a group of about 30 people. And I went up to my room. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon, and I took a breath, sat in this chair. I rented in this room. They had an iron chair, and I sat in it, and I just relaxed and allowed the intensity that I had built into through revealing all that I had revealed those 3 weeks. I let it all go, and it was kind of relieving. But within less than a minute, I noticed something had changed. I felt like a hot drop of wax had come in from above my head, through my head chakra, into my throat, and down into my heart, into my solar plexus. And on its way out, it made a frequency sound. So in the 3 to 5 seconds that it occurred, I knew there were 3 notes that had been played. There was an A that I did not hear, but it appeared in the first few seconds when this hot drop of wax, or felt like wax, dropped. I could feel the essence of the A, but it was dead silent, still, just like the afterlife. And then within a second, it changed to a consonant. From out of my solar plexus comes the sound of like an M, okay? And then it hit a higher pitch. So it went silent A, bad voice, can't reproduce it. But I can hear it and reproduce it in myself. And when the sound left me, the top of my head opened up. It felt like I had had a crack, and a flood of energy was coming out of it. I turned to someone, I said, it feels like I've got a fountain on top of my head. And I feel like there's a shape to it, but I'm different. I closed my eyes, and then I saw all these trees like an orchard in space. And all these apples were dropping way, way down in space, just dropping. And I felt a relief inside myself. And what it was, that the emotional ingredient in my thinking over the years, in my conclusions, you've heard me say that every condition comes about from the memory of an emotion enclosing and creating that behavior. So the way you feel when you make a conclusion can effectively be a hindrance or a liberation. So you either limit or liberate yourself. Well, what happened with me is I was liberated by the weight of all the thoughts and all the realizations. Everything that I had gained was gone. The feeling, the end, was empty. But I was relieved, and 2 words came to my consciousness: gracious peace. And then I knew I'd identified the rhythm. It was phenomenal. It was a repeat of what I experienced in the afterlife. I knew that this was going to come into our world, but it only happened to me. I checked, I looked around, I called people. Just me. Okay. So for 3 days and 3 nights, I settled into this rhythm and allowed it to shape and reshape my consciousness that had expanded. And I needed that because I needed time to adjust and recognize what I was now seeing. Because my eyesight, my actual vision had opened up. I was seeing things in front of me that I hadn't seen before, but I didn't know how. Up until that point, about 12 years after my accident, I had taught myself to see what I needed to see, whether it was someone's morality, someone's state of consciousness, someone's limitation. I had trained myself to look into it, to listen, be aware of it, and to find the necessary response or advice that I would give that individual. So it was a training process. I kept my brain involved with my rhythm, and I knew how to ground a rhythm. So under integrity, I would put all my new inspirations, and the feeling of integrity was the conclusion. So when this happened, I got to keep my integrity, but the weight of all these thoughts was gone. I ended up with gracious peace and an expansion of consciousness. To say the least, it was the most surprising event of my lifetime. I thought the afterlife was something, but this was a confirmation that I was now renewing and having achieved what I was intended to achieve in this lifetime. In the afterlife, I was shown, told, advised, informed, and I knew. But I lost a lot of that just coming back into form over time. So I had to review all of this. And at the end of the 12 years, this event occurs reminding me completely of everything I had not remembered or not been able to recall as well as I'd like. And when it was done, I was a different person. Well, I knew then that the next stage for me was renunciation. And I also felt that in my process. So from 1991 until 2001, I found myself, it was between 2000 and 2001 in the spring, I went through another initiation. In this one, I had gone to Mexico on purpose by myself for 6 weeks. I locked myself up in a room, and I only went out to get the food I needed and come back. The rest of the time I spent gazing out of this rather large window I had that was open right out into the ocean so I could see and all the flowers. It was quite nice. So it was a great opportunity for me to enter into the cave of the heart and the quiet the mind and achieve what I was hoping to achieve, the I am experience. I knew I was ready. I knew what to do. I thought it was going to take me 7 weeks. It took me less than 4. And when that happened, again, another transformation of consciousness, almost like a light anointing. And I was relieved of having to use my mind in the old way. Now I was using what I call higher mind, an intuitive consciousness of pure reason that belongs to more the higher self. So it was now mine. I could enact, use it, utilize it, and with that I was given the ability to look through and see future events in anyone's life. I could see how long it would take for them to find the solution they were looking for, to enact it, and what it would do. But I always looked to the vision of eternity that I was given to see these same individuals in that deep future. And sure enough, that's exactly what it would take. So I knew I was on track, and I kept going. And in 2005, I left Hawaii. I was there for 3 years teaching. I came back to Canada, and my intent then, after my son had gone to university, that would be in 2012, was to just give myself over to creating thought forms that were in the best interest of small groups of humanity, whether it was children in Syria, Lebanon, the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, or if it was some other part of the world where there was need for relief. I always found the way to intervene as best as I could, or to influence certain matters where I could with a group of souls. So that led me on to understand that the process that I went through is actually being enacted in this generation. So I realized, okay, so before the event that happens, what we call the ascension, something else is going to take place. And I call it the intervention. I remember having tried to invoke insight into the intervention multiple times. And finally, in 2014, I got it. And I realized, okay, it's time to go back to teaching. It's time to step out, but not yet. They told me to wait, wait, wait. Keep doing what I was doing, that time would come. And here we are today. So let me begin by telling you that beyond the restoration of the conscience of humanity, it was an intended intervention to give us a state of realization that would prepare us for the upcoming events. Now, a lot of you have heard of end times prophecy, the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. I'd like to clear up a few things. The word apocalypse really means revelation. And so when I understood the revelation of realization, I thought, oh, this is what humanity is going to get, their first taste of fully realized understanding. And I saw how it would happen. In the same way that it occurred to me, Gracious Peace in 1991, I saw humanity. I mean, it can happen at any time, but I saw humanity exposed to the same thing, the same rhythm. And at the end of it, people were exposed to their soul, the things they didn't know, like whether there was a real God or not, whether there was an afterlife, whether they had lived before, what the state of their consciousness was, the state of their morality, their conscientiousness, their integrity, their principles, their ethics. This is when it's going to be important to have lived a life of more moral solitude or moral balance at the minimum. Because during this initiation, exposure will occur. In other words, a person who's never studied will be going to lay down one night before bed, and it'll come on them and their family, and everyone will be bewildered for a few minutes as to what just took place. Others won't notice it at all. A few others will have an outstanding experience and transition they've been waiting for. And that's what they hope to have. But it is going to happen. And the ones that don't know much about themselves are going to have to face the shock of understanding what they've yet to clearly comprehend. Their shortcomings, everything about themselves, almost as if they're not repenting, but their conscience is exposed to them. Their state is exposed to them. I also know that there'll be a comforting during this process. The Comforter has already entered into our world and assisting Gaia, assisting humanity. Through this process, people will be balanced, and they'll have 3 days to decide how they want to respond to this new set of insights, these revelations, and what will happen next. Well, what will happen next is what I will now say. This intervention is a timely event, a spiritual event. I've never heard anyone talking about it on the internet or anywhere else. I'm the only one I know that has talked about this, including CCP. But I know that it's going to happen before the actual event. Now, what's the event? Let's talk about that. The event begins with a minimum period of restoration. In other words, right now, if you look at the news, you can see it. Since 2016, when Donald Trump was brought in as a new president, and I noticed it right away, I've always known that it always was going to be a matter of conscience that we would be seeing in the public eye. So I was attentive to matters of conscience on a large scale, political scale, or religious scale, and relating it to current events and weather in our world. I realized, oh yeah, as the intensity increases, as the frequencies change, as people become adjusted, and grace is in our life right now too, so that this process can be quickened, sped up, and we can all be eased into relieving ourselves of the negative tendencies of our ego. But it really is a trial and tribulation for the ego, not the soul. Our egos that are still not integrated are going to come under a degree of revelation itself, exposure that may cause points of humiliation, embarrassment, that kind of thing. And it will pass. But leading up to the event, there will be an increase on the conscientiousness of humanity. In other words, God's turning up the volume on our conscience. And somehow we're starting to sense this is more a fact. Our morality, our principles all become questioned. I'll go back to Trump. Since then, it's been 2 years. We're just approaching the elections, midterm elections. And I can say, Jay, just in the last few months, he has made so many statements out loud about conditions that we would, or I would normally think of. This is a matter of conscience. Why would he support people who lack conscience? Why would he want to make deals with people who lack conscience? Why are so many of his staff being fired, let go of, lacking conscience? And people are not unaware. They see this. And so the question about his morality, his ethics, his principles, even the former presidents are questioning this. In fact, the whole world is questioning it. You got the EU that's now starting its own military, thinking of de-dollarization from the US market, the Chinese along with them, all the BRIC nations with Russia. And so we're seeing these major changes, and they're all matters of conscience that most people are not noticing. And so what do I mean by that? I know that to restore our conscience, we have to recognize our lack of morality, our lack of care, genuine concern for each other. But I also know that humanity is still subject to the grand delusion. What they talk about in their book of Revelations about the grand delusion that even the elect will be tested. I'll tell you what it is. It's people believing they're human first. Now, I know there are people who are studying spiritually and they say, well, we're only human, but, and that's incorrect too. Until we see ourselves as divine beings in a human form, we won't make the necessary steps to identify what we're overcoming, which is the ego. And so, corruption, that's a primary word I want you to look for in the news. Whenever there seems to be a bit of corruption in the news, check it out again and you'll notice something different. I'll go back to Donald Trump. Not only did he encourage people to come to his side and resist the left, he said he was going to drain the swamp of all these notorious bad people who lacked morality, conscience, integrity, or at least what he suggested. That's why many Christians voted for him in the States. But the more I see it, like Kavanaugh, for example, it was a question of conscience. He gets voted in. Before he gets voted in, someone accuses him of abuse. That female came into the Senate, gave a testimony. People questioned her, mostly the men. But you could tell it was not going to go far unless she had some very detailed evidence that they were going to let it whitewash it over because it was a matter of power. It was a matter of power play. And I think one of the senators, I can't remember his name, the little fella, he was screaming how horrible this was to bring this up at such a time after such a long life of showing dedication and honesty and integrity, that Mr. Kavanaugh was now being exploited and abused from something that happened 36 years ago by an unknown woman who happened to drop off her deposition to Senator Feinstein in California as a setup. So you can see the infighting. I saw women from the Me Too movement. They all, women, of course, are our hope, our great hope. They're the ones that are able to point out, beyond mansplaining, what the abuse is and how lacks principle and conscience. And they're very determined to help men understand this needs to be considered. Now, you think for a second, what do we want from our leaders besides integrity, conscientiousness? We want clarity, transparency, honesty, truth. Will we ever get it? So we're settling for what? An ego that gives us some information about it but doesn't act on it. So what happens? Kavanaugh gets elected. He goes into now becoming one of the Supreme Court judges. And you know what's next. Everything that's going to happen will be a matter of conscience that needs to be registered by the public, identified, and people get to make personal choices on which side they feel or how they feel overall. But it's not just Kavanaugh and Mrs. Ford or the Senate that I'm referring to here and the president when it comes to matters of conscience. Well, how does humanity feel? Do we want to be judgmental? Do we want to punish? Well, we can't put CCP into our conscientious in our moral life without understanding it as a negative tendency. That is a condition that people suffer. So there has to be an allowance for that, meaning we can't just punish that person for being that way. Don't let them into the Supreme Court. Get rid of them. Destroy their lives. Well, that's not what we want to do either. But all we want is the truth. People are afraid to bring it up. What I'm noticing is that the universe is saying you will tell the truth or you will suffer. And what I see now is a pre-testing of humanity. And based on their choices, events will follow. Now we have the bin Salman from Saudi Arabia, Khashoggi, who goes to the Arab consulate. Apparently he was destroyed, mutilated, and taken out. And it was recorded. And now Turkey and America and everybody's talking about it. And of course, Mr. Trump can't let go of a deal like that It's about the deal. Even Pat Robertson, who was a former Christian evangelical, it can't be, we won't lose all this just because of one man. They're our allies. People come up with all the excuses they can to avoid the fact that, A, this is a matter of conscience. Why are people starving in one part of the world and not others? The people that are starving in one part of the world is because of a lack of conscience in another part. Why do we support the military to go and fight, assist, and support Al Qaeda, ISIS, and fighters in Syria? Because they wanted regime change and they didn't care how it cost. So now we're talking about bin Salman and what they want to do to punish him. And Germany's decided, well, he lacks conscience and he kills people outright, so we're not going to do any more business with him in the war making machinery industrial complex. We're not going to send them arms anymore. I'm not going to sell it. Canada now has to make a choice. And Mr. Trump is still willing to go ahead with the sale, but there needs to be some thinking, he says. Let's face it, folks. There's a lack of conscience everywhere, but why is it coming to the core? Why is it coming up to the surface? And why aren't they saying this in the news? We're watching how every one of these events includes society at large. How it's not just a decision for the lawmakers or for the people that perpetrated and brought this into being. It's all of us are involved. Does our nation have a conscience? Do other nations have conscience? Are there leaders in this world have such great integrity that they realize it would be in the best interest of our world for us to have peace, share technology, see yourself as a single race with various cultures and various colors? But we're all equal. So where are we going if not towards those ends of a consolidated, unified life for humanity with promise of a future based on our conscientiousness? When will we be ready to meet intelligence one-on-one that is not from this world? Why are we building AIs everywhere? To control humanity, to control events, to control the finances. Why is there no technology in this world like zero-point energy that we know exists everywhere in the military? How come we can't have it? We're the sheep. We're the people that need to be kept in the dump. We're the ones that are being subject right now to interference patterns in our skies with chemtrails and cores and you name it. They're doing everything they can to prevent us from recognizing that this event is coming so that we won't be prepared for it. We won't meet the demand. And the dark side will have a lot of souls to recycle and use their energy from. That's essentially the truth. A choice is coming up. And if we don't restore our conscience, well, you'll be part of the follow. If you do restore your conscience, you have a guaranteed future that looks much, much brighter than anything we have ever imagined here before. It's the end of ignorance and the beginning of a true enlightenment. And we're the generation that stands between both. In other words, we can see into our history how ignorant we have been over time. All the wars, all the killing, all the selfishness, all the destruction, whether we're through warlords or through religion, same thing. Is still a global preoccupation with power and money and greed and immorality and control and manipulation. In the last couple of days, I talked about all those dark tendencies that are a part of human nature that were genetically implanted into us. So as souls, we're subject to getting rid of this dark side of our humanity, attempting to reignite our soul's passions and attributes, manifest them so we're completely free of the ego, so we can return to the source. We can advance into the light. And that's been the story of every historical leader in our world. Either they had a conscience or they didn't. I want you to look back in time. I was shown over the last 25, 30,000 years how people who had no conscience but were in leadership affected society versus those who did have a conscience and put it into their leadership. You know, for every fallen civilization that we have found in our history, even in the last 10,000 years, always the same thing is repeating itself. Society gets together, they come in communities, they develop, they begin to prosper, and then when they prosper, they need to protect themselves. So they buy into the defense and protection of their group, their products, and their incomes. And eventually, the fear society that they buy into, life insurance, insurance benefits, mortgage insurance, car insurance, we buy these things and pay money from our income to support a protective society all around us and even now in our homes so that we're safe and sound and no one's going to come and attack us during the day or night in our home. Humanity made a decision a long time ago to give up their own divine sovereignty to a leader for that very protection so that we could walk down the street and trust no one was going to kill us. And we all agreed that democracy would be a good idea, that this leader, if it wasn't democracy, it was before that, it was the queens and kings of the world, the monarchies, who decided what was in our best interest and kept us safe with their armies and their taxation and everything else. So humanity seems to have always needed leaders, or at least that what we have been told to subject ourselves to. And these leaders have either had a conscience or they didn't. So if we look quickly over the last, say, 10,000 years, you can think of even the Romans, even before them, the Persians, every civilization that rose either came and restored their conscience or didn't. And if it didn't, it fell. Have we any successful civilizations in the last 10,000 years that still stand today? No. Sumeria is gone. The Middle East was gone. Atlantis is gone. There are documents, there are archives, there are utensils, tools, there are libraries. Ashurbanipal saves tons from Sumeria. So we know the historic value of having captured this information continues to show us that men of conscience and women of conscience who led this world, we all fared better. But when somebody lacked conscience, it cost humanity dearly and everyone paid for it. Hitler, guy lacks conscience, what's it cost the Germans and what's it cost humanity? We fight righteously to defend ourselves, we come away from it, and now we can keep our conscience and we start to restore ourselves. But now we get into a Cold War, a small war with North Korea, Vietnam, other places, then Iraq, Syria, Libya, Tunisia, all these countries, so-called Arab Spring. It was a plan to bring them down and redraw the lines and share the oil. It's about power, control, influence. It's not about living in the light of what the universe has given us and jumping to the opportunity to advance and to be liberated from the mortal realm of moral parole. Let me say that again. We are on mortal parole here. It's a parole. You're alive. It's mortal. Why? Because they don't want you to have much time to figure this out. And we're on parole by the universe until we restore ourselves. We are not allowed to expand into the universe and bring our darkness any further, at least not before a choice. There are dark forces out there, and they continue to exist, but they're fighting a war right now for their own lives. And it's come down to our local galaxy. Now, there are a few things that have occurred in our galaxy, such as other worlds that have already ascended the same way we're going to. And what I mean by that is that new changes occurred. In the normal ascension process in a world like ours, very few make it every generation. Very few. It would be like 0.0001%, which is a lot. Okay? And the ones that do are few and far between, and there's not, and they, if you ask those individuals how they feel about the rest of humanity, it's great compassion. They have, I can tell you, for probably 20 years, I've done invocations almost every night. on asking for this intervention on behalf of humanity who have been left conditioned and stuck in their egos without a way out, and so much so controlled by the influences of the frequencies through the news and through current events that they can't identify the truth for themselves anymore. When you go back and you think about the bin Salman Saudi situation with Khashoggi, and you got to ask yourself, does any nation respect the law, international law, to the point where no murder is being committed, where mercenaries are not killing people on behalf of the government? I remember Obama being tasked as saying he was probably the biggest killer the U.S. ever had when it came to drones. I don't know Mr. Trump personally, but I know that killing is continuing, and throwing 70 or 80 very expensive missiles into Syria and maybe only killing a few doesn't justify anything. The idea of going to war and killing, building up more nukes, needing more defense, spending on a new space force, why? That isn't humanity's goal anywhere. But they want to keep the economic system going and keep the technology away from us to present a new world. And they don't want to lose their power. So when it comes to the restoration of the conscience of humanity, you can see that it's not going to take a short while. It's going to take a long while without intervention. And that's why I suggested that there will be intervention and how it will affect us. I'll be back to talk to you about that in the next tape, and we'll conclude by talking about the ascension process that everyone has been talking about, expecting, and what you can expect to experience through it if you happen to be here. All right? Gracious peace. We'll see you on the next time. The next one is number 11. Thank you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, write in, ask for a conversation with me or an interview. And thank you for your time. Have a great day. Bye now.